U.S. President Donald Trump promised American liberation with his global trade war. The markets, though, appeared less than liberated. In fact, they appeared more panicked in the first half of the week, recording steep losses. Trump and his team had been adamant for weeks he was not, however, going to back down.
Would you be open to a pause in tariffs to allow for negotiations?
Well, we're not looking at that. We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals, and in certain cases they're going to be paying substantial tariffs.
Where is the room for negotiation?
I don't think there's any chance that President Trump's going to back off his tariffs. This is the reordering of global trade.
President Trump has a spine of steel, and he will not break. He said he's not considering an extension or a delay. I spoke to him before this briefing. That was not his mindset. He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect.
That last clip from the White House's press secretary, that's from Tuesday. On Wednesday, just a day later, Trump suddenly flipped the script.
Can you walk us through your thinking about why you decided to put a 90-day pause?
Well, I thought that people were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy, you know? They were getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid. Nothing's over yet, but we have a tremendous amount of spirit from other countries, including China. China wants to make a deal. They just don't know how quite to go about it.
With me to talk about that, Jason Kenney is a former Conservative cabinet minister and former premier of Alberta. Amanda Lang is CTV's chief financial correspondent and the host of Taking Stock on BNN Bloomberg. Ali Velshi is an MSNBC chief correspondent and host of The Weekend Show. Velshi, hi everybody. It's good to see you on this Sunday. Thank you very much for making the time. Ali, I just wanted to start off with you on kind of the latest in Trump world, and especially where tariffs are concerned, which is kind of this climb down on some key elements when it comes to the tariffs or the relationship with China, the trade war with China, and the tariffs on China. What do you think in that case, but even more broadly last week with the pause, made Trump blink?
Bond market, entirely the bond market. The normal trade is that stocks collapse. I mean, they collapsed more than they typically would last week. That money the money that is from massive investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, governments, should have gone into U.S. treasuries, causing the price of treasuries to go up and interest rates to come down. And the opposite happened. People got out of the safest bet in the world, the U.S. Treasury, causing interest rates to go up. Mortgage rates hit 7% last week. Something happened in which the world said, when there's danger, the U.S. dollar and U.S. treasuries are not the safest place to be. That's the thing that got some of Trump's advisors, like Scott Bessent, not the Peter Navarros of the world, the hawks, but some of them to say, this is dangerous. This is dangerous for America. It's dangerous for the dollar, and it's potentially dangerous for the world. So there were a number of other things at play, including some CEOs in Trump's ear, but the bond market was the main thing that spooked Donald Trump last week.
Amanda, just because there's pause on some of these things with China and more broadly the reciprocal tariffs for 90 days certainly doesn't mean, or at least 90 days, I guess, does not mean that the uncertainty around the trade war has dissipated at all. What do you think that translates to in both the regular stock market and the bond market?
In some ways, of course, it's more uncertainty, it's more unpredictability, so I think you'll see continued unease. A lot of players here, from business people to political leaders, are saying, look, give us tariffs, but fix them at a base rate, and let's get on with things. So that 10% tariff he keeps talking about, that may well be the end game, and it might feel like a huge relief to the world when we get there. Meantime, we have this huge unpredictability, and of course, it was just rational to wind back the tariffs on your biggest imports from China that you don't make, electronics, smartphones and laptops. So of course they were going to do that. China holds all the cards where that's concerned. The U.S.'s biggest export to China, soybeans. So China has the upper hand in some ways.
Amanda, there, Jason used the word rational. So much of what the last week has felt like has been the opposite of that, right? Irrational. There's some objectives that Trump talks about when it comes to China, or even trade more largely that the U.S. engages in, that makes sense. But the way he's going about it, the fact that this one individual was able to say, I'm going to do X, the markets went wild, and now I'm going to do Y. Like, how absurd is this moment that we're in?
You know, it's a truth is stranger than fiction right now. If somebody proposed this as a Hollywood screenplay, we'd be rejecting rejected for implausibility. I was at a conference last week in Washington, last weekend, where Scott Bessent was speaking, and a lot of American business leaders, they were febrile with almost panic about what was going to happen to markets this week. And a lot of those are folks that had supported Donald Trump. Look, the Americans have very legitimate trade concerns vis-a-vis China, as does Canada and I think the rest of the developed world. There are rational ways of pursuing that. Why doesn't he lead an effort, for example, to say they are offside their WTO commitments? Look, 25 strikes and you're out. Build a global coalition to stop unfair Chinese trading practices, industrial espionage, market manipulation, and so forth. Instead, what he may have ended up doing here is alienating his closest friends and allies, starting with Canada, to make that kind of coalition to deal with unfair Chinese trading practices even more difficult. So, you know, the irony is when Trump was elected, there was a Trump bump in the markets because of the promise to cut taxes, deregulation, perhaps end ESG overreach, and all of those potential gains, all those gains have been completely wiped out because of the one thing that's kryptonite for markets, which is uncertainty.
He doesn't seem, though, from a, I guess, I don't know, I don't want to use the word strategic, Ali, but more ideological perspective, to care about a lot of what Jason laid out. He seems like if there are many inconsistencies in who he has been and the policies and positions he's put forward over the years, tariffs are not among them. He's been pretty consistent in believing that they will do what he says they will do, despite, you know, every piece of evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, and I haven't been on Canadian TV for a while, so I don't know what the rules are. This isn't policy. This is just stupid. He doesn't understand what a trade deficit is. He doesn't understand what, I mean, we had the country other than China on which we imposed the greatest tariffs before the pause last week was the landlocked country of Lesotho in Africa. That mostly sends us some diamonds, but mostly sends us some textiles that we don't want those jobs in America. He thinks it's a trade deficit because they only buy very little from us because they've got a GDP per capita of $1,000. There's nothing we make that they want to buy. He just doesn't understand. He's always thought that if you give somebody money for something they give you, that's a trade deficit. But that's not true. I go to the grocery store every day and I give them money for something, for eggs they took care of and tomatoes somebody else grew. That's the deal. That's the transaction. We have money, you have goods. I understand that there's an important desire to bring manufacturing back to the United States, but we need to know what kind of manufacturing that is. It's got to be high-wage manufacturing. That has to start with a strategy and then use tariffs as a tool to achieve that strategy. He's just all about the tariffs. So I don't even refer to it as policy or ideology. It does not make sense. It doesn't make sense whether you're conservative. It doesn't make sense whether you're liberal. And remember, both conservatives and liberals would like freer trade. So they would like to achieve something that looks like a strategy. They're not getting that from Donald Trump.
Amanda, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I mean, the only thing I will say is we should not, those covering all of this and following it, should not fall victim to the storylines. Yes, China can be a bad actor when it comes to trade, but all countries have protections on trade. Free trade does not mean zero barriers. It never has. Right. Now, China can be particularly egregious. It has human rights activities that we definitely can take issue with. But don't forget that President Biden imposed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a host of protectionist measures that probably run contrary to a lot of World Trade Organization rules. We allow these things within limits. The U.S. is actually being a bad actor on trade on its own. And what I would say is, maybe they're stupid, but what they're definitely doing is propagating lies over and over again until we all sort of believe the baseline that maybe there's bad actors out there on trade. And I would just say, let's remember, the U.S. is just as bad as everyone else. We have dairy subsidies. The U.S. has a massive farm bill that you could crush a small child with. So it's not as though this isn't behavior we all engage in. Let's not fall victim to their party line.
Yeah.
Just if I could quickly follow up with you on the more long-term implications of everything everyone is describing for the economy, because we are kind of consumed in the immediacy with how every country is reacting and counter tariffs and immediate reaction on the markets, for example. But in the medium to long term, particularly where Canada's economy is concerned, what are you looking for? or looking at?
I mean, we are looking at what we do well. So we actually have a huge domestic economy, and services and businesses that do business only here domestically is actually the bulk of our economy. Yes, we export hugely important goods, and we'll continue to do that. The world will need our resources. So I think overreaction is a mistake. We do need to fight this step by step. There's no other way. We can't ignore it, that it's all happening. But I'm actually on the optimistic side of the ledger when it comes to what's in store for us. We will settle into some new trading relationship with America and probably our other trade partners where a more protectionist environment is the name of the game. But again, that's been happening since 2016, right through that Biden presidency. So we all have to adjust to that. We'll look for new trading partners, but more importantly, we'll look to our own strengths and figure out how to capitalize on them in a way that we haven't been doing it the way we should.
Are you as optimistic, Jason?
Well, I'm optimistic if we get domestic policy right, particularly on resource exports, infrastructure, pipelines, LNG. I was a member of the Harper government that took Canada from 6 to 45 free trade agreements, so an increase of 39 free trade agreements in a deliberate effort to diversify our export markets and be less dependent on the United States. 10 years later, we are no less dependent on the United States, even after we had effective free trade with Europe and Asia through CETA and TPP. Why? Because most of what we export is natural resources. That's what we have that the world needs. Oil, particularly, gas, and the blockages on getting LNG done, coastal oil pipelines has been the greatest impediment to export diversification and being a wealthier country. But more broadly, expanding our ports and our rail, moving forward on accessing critical minerals, the Ring of Fire, all of those are, that is how we're actually going to create real wealth. Otherwise, you know what we're exporting? Essentially ag products. We don't produce much manufacture that the world hasn't, the world is demanding. So it comes down to whether we get serious about energy infrastructure, simplifying the regulatory process, speeding up approvals. That's got to be, for me, a central issue in the Canadian election.
Just very quickly, if I follow up on that, do you think, though, if we take a few steps back, the kind of quote-unquote free trade relationship we believe has existed throughout all those decades, and successive governments have had an eye to that and signing free trade agreements all around do you think that relationship with the U.S. will ever be as we knew it?
Not entirely. I think, you know, at some point, MAGA is going to lose its grasp on power, but I think Amanda's right. We can't assume that if power shifts back, for example, to the Democrats in Washington, that protectionism will dissipate. You know, Kamala Harris voted against USMCA because she thought it was insufficiently protectionist. And part of what Trump is doing here is moving the center of American political discourse more onto the side of protectionism. There are a lot of protectionists in the Democrat Party. So no, we should not assume that we're going to get back to normal, being broad free trade with the United States. We have to double down on export market diversification. But that's not just about sending ministers to conferences to talk about progressive trade. It means actually building the infrastructure so we can sell what we produce that the world wants. When I first met Narendra Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat in 2008, he said, I want your LNG. We haven't moved an ounce of LNG onto the Pacific market since then. The world wants our resources. Let's sell it to them.
LNG Canada comes online in a few months, I believe. So we'll leave it on that note. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate the discussion. Ali Velshi, Amanda Lang, and Jason Kenney. Thanks.